So we've heard now about the steps in broad terms that the government is taking to improve the ease of doing business, the investment attractiveness of Uzbekistan. In putting together this panel, I wanted to drill a little bit deeper into some of these issues and look at it from different perspectives. So we'll be looking at the macroeconomic picture, we'll be looking at an example, a case study of difficult reform that has shown a real capacity for institutional change in the government and in society. We'll be hearing a little bit about how exactly the fabric of kind of the decision-making has changed in the past few years in Uzbekistan and why that matters. And also we'll take a look at where Uzbekistan might be relative to other countries that have attempted similar reforms. But many of you will have seen that outside we have this report that's been prepared by Chris Weafer and his team, and it's a phenomenal, I think, distillation of sort of the macroeconomic picture in Uzbekistan. And so to begin, I thought I would ask Chris to maybe give some highlights of this report, and then I have some specific questions around things that stuck out to me. So what can you tell us about, where we are with the market fundamentals, and how is that going to drive growth, hopefully, if everything goes to plan?
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this event. I know we kind of are on a tight schedule, so I'm not going to read this page by page. Obviously, we go through a lot of the topics and provide all the detail in the report. So let me just highlight a couple of things. The first point, just to bear in mind, I guess it's a restatement of the obvious, is that because of the transition of the last couple of years, do not rely on the historic data. One of the reforms that Uzbekistan, the Ministry of Finance, is now undertaking is, of course, to bring the data collection and analysis and presentation up to international standards. So that's an evolving process. So we regularly get questions about how the numbers that are presented currently, how they compare with the historic trend, and the obvious answer is just ignore the historic trend. The numbers are getting more reliable and are broadening out and will become kind of more extensive as we go forward. But with that said, just where we are in the economy today, first of all, Uzbekistan has the most diversified economy in the region, in the Central Asia region. And that's important because if you look at countries neighboring Kazakhstan, of course, in particular, and other countries that are very dependent on extractive industries or hydrocarbons, you have a lot of volatility. And investors tend to look at those economies with a view to what did they expect on the oil price, gas price, or particular metals, or power sector, as in the other countries. So Uzbekistan is much more diversified. If you look at the structure of the economy, if you look at the structure of exports in particular, it is very well spread. So in that sense, the country is in a much kind of better position in terms of looking long-term and being able to kind of make different scenario assumptions in terms of long-term investments. The economy is stable, as we saw it on some of the slides earlier. The growth will be 5.5% to 6%. That's real growth. It's very diversified. It's coming from agriculture. It's coming from construction. It's coming from transport. It's coming from, of course, the emerging consumer. So it's not just one area. It's not just because of, say, oil price or because of price of gold or copper, etc. It's diversified, and therefore that kind of number is very stable and should remain in kind of that stable range, 5.5% to 6% for the next several years. Rather than just kind of repeating, I suppose, what's in the brochure, let me highlight some of the kind of difficult areas, some of the areas that investors are now sort of having to deal with. That there is a collateral damage effect for such a high pace of growth. And that's not a criticism of the high pace of growth. I mean, I think in the sense of what Uzbekistan has done in the last several years has been fairly phenomenal in the history of emerging markets. But in the sense that any emerging economy has got to deal with the same issues. And Uzbekistan is dealing with them at a rapid pace compared to other countries. And because of that rapid pace, we are getting collateral damage. One of those, of course, is the high rate of inflation. So it's mid-teens, about 15, 16%. That is unavoidable given the kind of rise in wages, which is driving the consumer sector. It's unavoidable because of the rise in budget spending, which is required to stimulate growth. So it is a relatively suppose, short to medium term factor. It is very credible to assume that inflation should be back to the National Bank's target range of 5 to 7% within a couple of years. But for this year, next year, maybe dragging it to 2020 to 2021, it is an issue. And that means that the National Bank's policy rate must also remain high at 16%. And that, of course, causes difficulties for entrepreneurs and small businesses looking to expand, looking to borrow money in the country. You're facing with 16% as the policy rate, which probably means if you're a small business, you're looking at 25%. So then that causes difficulties, and of course, it slows the pace of expansion. But I stress that these are kind of collateral damage kind of consequences that should last only for a couple of years, and then we should move into a more normal pattern. Currency is another issue, and again, it's collateral damage, and I could be using that word. There was no other choice. Of course, we had the devaluation several years ago when the government reformed the currency exchange system, the monetary system, and this year you'll see that there was a big drop in the value of the som in August. So this year, 12% devaluation against the dollar, which is the worst in the region with the exception of Iran. So it's partly a consequence of reform. The National Bank, quite rightly, are moving away from trying to control the currency, from easing the volatility limits. But also, of course, it has to be said that a weak currency is very good for competitiveness. It means that Uzbekistan exports are more attractive, are better priced in the region. It helps develop the economy. So again, it's something that I would expect kind of more of in the kind of short to medium one-off categories. And our projection is in the next several years, we'll see a much more modest kind of decline or relatively small, say 1 to 3 or 4% decline in the currency for a couple of years, rather than a repeat of the declines we've seen this year. We also have to point out the deterioration in some of the other indicators that have been highlighted, such as the trade deficit is expanding, the current account deficit is expanding on the back of that. Again, there is no choice. These are consequences of fast-paced opening up the economy. Consumers are buying more imported goods. Companies that are looking to modernize and expand need to buy equipment, need to buy imported services. Again, it's something that it's not unexpected for a couple of years during the transition, but eventually, of course, what you expect is that those companies that are now importing equipment and services and ingredients will be better established, will be making more product to service the domestic market, and will be exporting. So really then, rather than kind of dwell on points that we've covered in the report, we can say is that Uzbekistan is in a very strong economic position, despite kind of with the issues, the negatives that I've just highlighted. It is a stable economy, it is a diversifying economy, and it is a much more diversified economy than anywhere else in the region, and that's a huge plus for attracting investment, and it makes life a lot easier for people like myself and companies like ourselves, where we're doing scenario analysis for our clients who are looking at opportunities in Uzbekistan. The deterioration in areas such as budget, current account deficit should all be fairly temporary over a couple of years. And of course, the one big factor that I should mention is that Uzbekistan has got a very attractive balance sheet in terms of relatively low debt, less than 30% sovereign debt to GDP. So it can very easily absorb these deficit in the budget and deficit in other areas for several years, as you would expect. So some concerns, but mainly a very positive economic story.
Thank you, Chris. Let me ask you to just give a little bit more detail on one point that stuck out to me in the report, just briefly. I mean, you mentioned that obviously the inflation issue is being driven by increased household consumption and maybe the change in fiscal policy. But there was another point in the report that obviously the devalued currency is increasing the cost of imports, and that's also contributing to inflation. So I wonder, I mean, what is the way out for the government? Because obviously devaluation is useful from an export standpoint, but it has this inflationary impact. How do you sort of get to a Goldilocks solution where basically the level of inflation is low enough, but you're getting a weak enough currency, and that would allow you to reduce the interest rates which I'll highlight, and this will come up later in the conversation, is going to be very important for the development of the capital markets, because encouraging domestic investors to put their capital in stocks means that that rate of return has to compete with, at the moment, 16% interest rates.
Sure, okay, yeah, good question, as you say, because volatile currencies in particular, and the prospect of weak currencies, is probably the single biggest negative for foreign investors looking to come into the country. Nobody wants to lose money on currency conversion. Look, it is something that you see in other developing economies. It's not unusual, trying to find what is the right level for the currency to balance those factors, as you've said. Look, in the last couple of years, we've had a huge devaluation in the Russian ruble, which helped the economy. And now that ruble is very stable. The central bank is able to manage it. And Russian inflation, which was also almost 20% in 2015, is now down to 4%. To some extent, the same in Kazakhstan when they were forced to devalue the tenge as a one-off. So, it's so long as it's a one-off, and you can see that this is kind of a one-off adjustment. As we mentioned, the economy is in a very fast pace of change. So, trying to find out what is the optimum level for the currency is a little bit like trying to catch a kind of a falling knife for a while. But, and there's no reason to assume that the National Bank kind of won't, find what is that right rate. It may well be the current rate, or it may require a little bit further devaluation, but we're fairly close to finding what is that kind of optimum and stable rate. And I would expect the National Bank, therefore, to follow exactly the same route as we've seen in Russia and Kazakhstan and other developing economies. They then will kind of try to maintain kind of a stability in that currency to avoid volatility, which really drives everybody crazy. And then, having established the rate, it's a lot easier to target inflation or to inflation target, which is what they say they're going to do. So by 2021, maybe 2022, realistically, we should be in that inflation targeting phase with a more stable currency and with inflation well below the 10% level. That's what you would expect, and there's no reason why that won't happen in Uzbekistan. There are no kind of red flags to say, it's not going to happen because of this, which might be the case if the economy was very dependent on a particular product, such as oil price, and it's not. So therefore, it should be a lot easier for the National Bank to achieve what it says it wants to achieve in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I recommend everyone to pick up a copy of that report. So we've heard a little bit about the big picture question of economic reform, but in my first trip to Tashkent earlier this year, I was lucky enough to talk to Jonas, and what he described in his experience was actually, I think, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that I had that the reform agenda is achievable. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that story that you told me and why it worked, and the work that you've been doing for the ILO, particularly on the cotton harvest in the country.
Yes, thank you. I would be more than happy to do that. So I work for the ILO. We are a specialized UN agency promoting rights and interests of workers and employers in 187 countries, and we have been in existence for 100 years this year. So I live in Tashkent, and I've been living in Uzbekistan for 3 years with my family. And I don't know how many of you have been to Uzbekistan, but when you go there, you will see cotton everywhere. You eat plov on a plate with a cotton pattern, you drink tea, and there will be cotton symbols on the teacup. I look at this all these logos behind me. You can look at the logo of the ministry, it has cotton in it. Even the conference, I see a cotton flower at the conference here, and the OFB logo, there's cotton as well. Cotton is everywhere in Uzbekistan. And indeed, historically, up to 90% of the agricultural land was used for cotton production. Today, it's lower, it's 70%, and it's all changing, but that's part of the story. Now, forced labor in the cotton harvest used to be a very sensitive issue. The cotton harvest in Uzbekistan, as far as we know, is the world's largest labor effort. 2.5 million people pick cotton every year in October and November. We don't know of any other event in the world where 2.5 million people are recruited for an event like that. So this is a significant event. And forced labor used to be something very sensitive. I picked up this magazine outside, and I look at page 9, and on page 9 you have 10 key reforms of the president of Uzbekistan. Number 1, eradication of forced labor in the cotton harvest and beyond. I think this tells us something about the confidence of the government in this reform and in this process. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do and the story about how Uzbekistan eradicated systematic forced labor in the cotton harvest. The ILO has been monitoring for child labor and forced labor in the cotton harvest since 2013. And since 2015, we also monitor for forced labor. We conducted in last year's harvest, it's a little bit too early to talk about this year's harvest, it's only just finishing, but last year we conducted 11,000 interviews of workers, farmers, business entrepreneurs and others. We look at legislation, enforcement mechanisms, we look at the media, we really take a broader approach to the monitoring of this issue. First thing I would like to say, just to be very, very clear, there is no systematic child labor in the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan anymore. We can safely take that issue and park it over here. So let's talk about forced labor. So what did we find when we conducted all these interviews and we did the monitoring? We find that the wages for cotton pickers have been increased by over 200% over the last 3 years. We find that the government has put in place hotlines, feedback mechanisms where people can call either using the phone or Telegram, which is like WhatsApp in Uzbekistan. 2,500 cases were received by the Ministry of Labor last year, and those cases were investigated by labor inspectors within 24 to 48 hours. We also saw fines increased, fines for forced labor, 1,000% increase this year, 10 times higher fines for forced labor, and criminalization is coming. We saw awareness-raising campaigns, banners, brochures, text messages going out to people, raising awareness about their rights for denying or for saying no to participating in the harvest if they wish so. We saw a privatization and a liberalization of the industry. Today, 63% of areas used for cotton production is privatized under textile clusters. We also see journalists reporting openly on forced labor. Today there's a freedom for the media to talk about these issues. We have seen how the government is now working with human rights activists, with civil society. We've been participating in a dialogue process since 2017 where former political prisoners, independent human rights activists are engaged in a dialogue process with the government, and they're helping now to do the monitoring and to raise awareness. The result is that in 2018, 93% of the pickers were voluntary. So there is no more systematic and systemic forced labor in the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan. It has been replaced by a systematic effort to eradicate forced labor. So we still have work to do at the local level about implementation. There's still work to do, but I'm really pleased to say that what I believe has been a barrier for investors to come to Uzbekistan has now been removed.
So I want to sort of ask you a little bit about the incentives for reform, because I think it's important for everyone in the audience, you know, why this case study matters. One thing that struck me is that obviously this is very much a case of there being an entrenched system in the case of how the harvest was conducted, and that it was very pertinent to state-society relations for there to be an initiative on the part of the President Mirziyoyev and the new government to address this issue. Now, on one hand, you've described that there's obviously an economic incentive, but economic incentives can come and go. And so I was curious to know from you briefly, I mean, how do you see that factoring in versus other incentives about, let's say, responsibilities between the government and the citizenship? And can you see that broadening? So I imagine the ILO's mandate will go further. Do you anticipate being able to build on that mandate that you've received for this project into other areas?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. There is definitely an economic incentive for doing these reforms and also changing the whole agricultural system away from a state-planned system to a market-based model. I think that sort of also underpins this. The dialogue between government officials and, in this case, civil society, it was in fact the government that approached us and said, could you please help facilitate this dialogue process? We've seen a complete shift in the way the government speaks about these issues. Mirziyoyev himself, at his address to the United Nations in 2017, it was less than a minute into his speech where he mentioned forced labor, and he put it as a priority for the government to eradicate forced labor. We have also seen how He speaks with sympathy towards labor migrants going abroad to work. There's been a shift. There's been a human face, if you like, from the side of the government to engage civil society. And indeed, this is spreading. There are many opportunities for broadening this engagement beyond simply child labor and forced labor. And we can see that already happening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Akram, Jonas just mentioned this point of dialogue. And so at the Agency for Information and Mass Communication, dialogue is really what you're working on, dialogue between the government and the citizens of Uzbekistan, dialogue between the government and the international investor community. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of new push for transparency and particularly how it's also feeding into access to information that will be important for investors, like financial data or information about government economic planning?
Thank you very much, Ifandiar, and also Jonas, that his speech goes so smoothly into mine. Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend my personal appreciation and also of my agency to you, Ifandiar, and to Adam Smith Conferences, and also the whole Eurasian Investor team for organizing this. Just briefly about myself, I returned to the country at the beginning of the year, about February, and there was a drive by our government and also by our president to bring in educated compatriots who actually have experience of working in Western countries. I spent almost 18 or 19 years of the last 20 abroad, and to be sitting here and representing my country is extremely, it fills me with a lot of pride, but it's also a transformation, my personal transformation, that I was away and I was fairly, I would say, critical. And now sitting here and speaking about reform process in my country. And this transformation, I believe, is real, and it's driven by, as also Jonas mentioned, by irresistible vision of progress by our president. And the country is really buzzing now. It's ambitious. We can see almost this impatience for reform and for results, and naturally we face certain challenges. But at the time of reform, time is the most. At the period of reform, time is very limited resource, and we are aware of that, and we work at around the clock to see more results. But we can have various assessments of where we are, but it's certainly not for the lack of effort. And modern Uzbekistan is no longer the country that it used to be only a few years ago. Since 2016, one defining characteristic of our country has been the initiation of these wide-ranging reforms. And also, the country is changing and the public is changing, and we've chosen the path of openness, of democracy, the path that ensures constitutional rights of our citizens and the right of our citizens to freedom and access to information. And a society that's truly built on liberty, freedom, and prosperity. I mean, these are big words, but these are the words that are entrenched in the vision of our president and also entrenched in the reform process that we are undertaking. Now, to build a society where functioning institutions provide checks and balances, and also the rules of the game are based on rule of law, you need freedom of media, you need freedom of access to information, and you need an alert public that understands these processes and also participates in the life of the country. So some of the key objectives of our Agency for Information and Mass Communication were ensuring openness, transparency of all government institutions and also state-owned enterprises, and assisting them also in establishing effective communication with all stakeholders and the public. And we understand that in order to develop really effective functioning investment climate, we need to provide all decision makers with timely, accurate, detailed information, and to ensure that we're covering the reforms and also the challenges that we're facing while implementing these reforms, and that the public has access and has platforms where the public can express also their own concerns and vision and how they see the challenges that we're going through. And our agency also recognizes the high standards and expectations that we have from the international community, and we encourage our government stakeholders to meet and exceed them. Now, what we realize is that we need transparent, fair, efficient institutions. That's one, and investors get openness. Also, the public does, and we do believe that free media plays an important, crucial role in this. And you will see that our digital print is showing a certain level of already vitality. It's quite vibrant. Social media, I would say, is even more vibrant. And then there is no fear. I mean, if you take prior regime where we had, coercion and fear, and people would be very scared of expressing themselves. And now we have social media, which, if you take traditional media as fourth estate and the fourth power, I mean, we see social media is probably the fifth power. And even if you refer to recent Sacha Baron Cohen's concern at how quickly it's developing, we are in the same trend, but there is freedom that people feel, and they can participate in these processes. For instance, during the last 3 years, we had a few concerns about protection of private property, which I'm sure for investors is quite important. But reporting on certain cases where this protection was not ensured, and the government would be able to quickly react to people's concerns and rectify certain mistakes of government officials, that's also a sign that the public has the platform to actively participate in these processes, to highlight the problems, and then the government can react quite quickly. What's also important is that prior, 3 years ago, before, we didn't have access to one of the major media outlets in the world. Now we've given permanent accreditation to BBC Uzbek, Voice of America, Fergana, Deutsche Welle, Eurasian, net.org, the Human Rights Watch, meaning we are at the stage where we are ready to discuss our problems. We are ready to face them, we are ready to admit them, we are ready to address them. So there's a fundamental shift in position of the government of how to engage also with own public and also foreign public on really pertinent and, as Jonas said, critical issues. There is the accreditation mechanism of foreign journalists has been simplified significantly. You've seen yourself, you visit the country. We're engaging with foreign press. We are quite open. I mean, for members of foreign press, you can always access. I'm here, and we can create more press tours. And the level of access that you had was quite on high level.
Yes.
I'm sure you will admit. Our president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, also adopted, through his initiative, a resolution that ensures openness of state bodies. And we have initiated the process of creation of 160 press services that have been building their capacities, because the agencies is trying to strengthen their capacities for them to provide quicker, swifter information out to the public, but also prepare our government institutions and also our high-ranking officials on how to engage with public. Because we recently had certain cases when officials probably said more than they should, and they were quite widely publicized events. And 2 or 3 days ago, the president issued a very strong rebuke for all government officials, where he stressed a certain responsibility that the government has in engaging with press. So in many ways, we have these processes ongoing. We do believe that for investors and also for our own entrepreneurs, we need free media and free access to information, and functioning and strong and independent fourth estate, which needs support, which needs free to work freely. So we do believe that it's one of the important tenets of liberal democracy and also free functioning investment climate, and we will continue this course. I'm absolutely positive that the strong will of the president and his government's devotion and enthusiasm will certainly let us achieve these goals.
Thank you, Akram.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask Aziza to respond actually to something you said at the beginning of your contribution, which was that in many cases, certainly your role in this transformation, and I think part of the larger change in the agenda is about people like yourself coming back to the country. And so there's this question of human capital. Who are the individuals making up the key institutions of government and also in business? And clearly they're working around the clock. I can tell you from experience, and I'm sure many of you will know, that it's not unusual to get a message on Telegram at midnight with a presentation or something that needs to be attended to. It's a credit to the hard work that's being taken by the government. Aziza, maybe you can give a little bit of a glimpse into how you think that really the human capital dimension is playing out, because that, it's both going to be the main driver of reform and economic development. It's also the constraint. I mean, at the end of the day, getting the right talent and the right capacities into the right institutions is a challenge for any government. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about this, so it'd be good to have your thoughts on where we are on the human capital question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, like in many developing countries, we always hear this, the dilemma between the youth bulge or positive demographic dividend. And I would like to, given a broad stroke, what changed in the last 3 years that hopefully will make us a bit closer to the demographic dividend, rather than just seeing youth as something that would be creating unnecessary tension. So in Uzbekistan, there were 3 very good moves, in my view. First of all, there was a recent program on covering 100% of kids with preschool education. That is, as you may know, is very good for cognitive development. And for example, by 2030, the idea is that every single child before school, the child will go and be trained. That has been recommendation by World Bank and UNICEF for many, many years, but only now it actually comes to fruition. And I think it's very good for ensuring that we are building the cohort of young generation that is competitive on the labor market in future. Second is very important in my view. Uzbekistan has been for a very long time at the top tier in terms of access to tertiary education. There is a World Bank ranking, and we would be somewhat equivalent to some African countries. But again, there was a new concept endorsed recently on the reform of the higher education institutions, and the target is very clear: to increase the coverage with tertiary education up to the level of 50% by 2030. So again, the whole idea is to create a level play field to welcome private universities from abroad and create locally to enable education to become fit for purpose, producing cadres, so people that are able to immediately move to the labor market and again bring added value. And the third is very important. That's about creating social lifts for lots of young people that will enable them to prosper in this life. So these 2 things are very important. But then you may ask the question, what happens to those who are not covered by higher education? I think Uzbekistan is really playing now with IT and how to make technology unleash the potential. I sit on the board of the organization that runs, for example, co-working spaces. So we started as the first ones in the country. Now we've got 6 co-working spaces, and new coming up. A lot of elements of ecosystem for entrepreneurship emerged in the country in the last 3 years. And the latest program that was launched called 1 million coders for the country. So country would like to see how we can train students that are not, or young people not covered by institutions, by universities, with the skills that will enable them again to get employed and prosper and get money. So IT is very interesting. And of course, we may be in a less beneficial position compared to India because we don't have English as a franca lingua, but kids are studying English now. I mean, you can see at every corner in Tashkent, in capital at least, the courses for language, IELTS, or it can be just speaking English. There's a huge appetite for English. So I think that all of this combined together provide quite a good workforce for those investors who would like to come. I also would like to speak about transformative changes in terms of how these young people can find themselves in new realities. And I really would like to note that the fact of social media becoming a feedback loop is very important. So people do read news on social media instead of a conventional gazettes or newspapers. People find job on social media. People raise concerns if they have. And just to provide you also a balanced approach, I think we still are facing two challenges, and how we're going to address them will exactly show whether we will be able to fully utilize the benefits of the reform period. The first, of course, is still remaining, and it's very much common across the former Soviet Union. We still have this urban and rural divide. So it's important how we can lessen the difference and discrepancy between the standard of living in the rural areas versus the cities, with all access to equitable service delivery and other things. But second, of course, is important. It's about how we undergo the process of building quality institutions. Again, the same challenge could be relevant to Russia, to Kazakhstan, to Kyrgyzstan, and as our company, for example, we do work outside of Uzbekistan and Central Asia. This is very much common trait. So how we are able to build inclusive institutions that will enable participation by citizens, including, of course, younger generation, in the decision-making processes and in the overall prosperity of the country. The way we're going to tackle these two issues will exactly make us either having youth bulge or having a very positive demographic dividend in future.
I want to question about maybe a third challenge, another divide of inclusiveness. So, one of the areas I think for improvement that I've identified, if we have the good fortune to run this event again, is to have more women business leaders and government officials up here in the program. And so I thought, if you could briefly comment on how you think we are seeing efforts to develop an ecosystem so that also there's more women in leadership positions in the country.
Now, I have to say that this is area where exactly we've got some progress, because 3 years ago, it was not even okay to talk about gender inequality. Now it's not only okay to talk, the government is really taking this seriously. And that becomes a new norm that we in Uzbekistan have more female in different type of panel discussions. And I did notice that in this conference, we are definitely lacking. I actually even did a head count, only 3 female in your program will be speaking today. So it's my privilege to be one of 3. But again, there's something that I think we see very good progress, because the issue was taken up very seriously. I see that we've got more and more role models in the society where female were promoted, not only because they're female, but also because they're very competent, very good ones. That's fantastic in terms of showing and paving the way for younger generation. But I also think that finally people realize that you cannot be hoping to be successful as a country if you do not tap on potential of half of your population. So half of the population are female in Uzbekistan. You can either ignore them, or you can really make them part of the discussions, be at the table, earn money, contribute, pay taxes, and then you become wealthier as a nation. There's also a very important proverb, Oriental proverb, that I like very much. If you give education to a son, you raise a nobleman. If you give education to a girl, you raise a noble and smart nation. So I think it's all about how we see the future horizon, how we are able to understand the old resources, and how we really harness everybody in this long-term game to unleash potential of Uzbekistan and become prosperous. But again, the trend is very positive.
Great.
I'm happy to see so many young generation, so many young women who are aspiring for more. And I think that also very much supported by the very high level of the government as well, unlike before.
Excellent. So, Ben, we're about to turn to you. I just want to mention we have about 10 minutes left. I will take 3 questions from the floor. So if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and my colleague Regina will have a microphone ready for you. And we'll take those questions all at once before we move into the next panel. Ben, so the final word, and I think it's an important one. We've heard a lot of good news about the progress that's being made. You're in the business of political risk. You've looked at sort of these types of trends in other countries in the region, in the wider CIS. And I guess the big question is, Mr. Kudratov in his presentation really highlighted the idea that from the standpoint of the government, these reforms are irreversible. I mean, what is your assessment of what that word means? Are we past the point of no return in the good sense of it? And how do you see, I think, the way forward in ensuring that the momentum and the progress that's been made over the last 3 years is kept?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are certain things where there is no route back. I think the president has set out a clear vision that he sees Uzbekistan as an international player, an important regional player, and a drive to become a market-led, export-oriented economy. And I think certainly during visits to Uzbekistan, speaking to people in Uzbekistan, I think that course has been set and it's been accepted across the country and has been welcomed. And I think that will not change, certainly in the near future. Speaking to people in Uzbekistan, certainly, I was there last month, for example, there is a slight sense of malaise in the country that maybe reforms are not moving as fast as they would like. But I have to say that, expectations are really high in Uzbekistan, and they're going to be extremely difficult to meet. We've had some really big wins, and I don't want to underestimate the scale of these wins and the impressiveness of them. The currency reform, restoring relations with the neighbors, work, as we've heard, on labor reform and things like that. These are critical and certainly not easy things to be done, and they've been done at an incredible pace in the last couple of years. But we are really at the beginning. Uzbekistan still has a long way to go in this story. And I would think from the point of view of investors looking at Uzbekistan, there are a couple of things that they'd want to look out for. And certainly it's very welcome to hear from the ministry that there's a lot of discussion about people being ready to discuss the problems and overcome the problems. I think there's a couple of things that we'd like to see in terms of the investment climate and the political risk environment. The first is a reduction of the role of the state, and this is certainly an ambition that the government has laid out, and certainly moves have been made to do that. So we've had examples of price liberalization in food processing and food markets, in utilities and things like that. We've had obviously the issuance of the Eurobond, which is a really important event this year, and yesterday's announcement on the banks has also been important. So I think reducing the role of the state will mean reforming state-owned enterprises. That is going to be an enormous challenge. They're a huge part of the economy. They're an extremely politically and institutionally powerful part of the economy. So there is a lot of work to be done there. Of course, the big prize here is Uzbekneftgaz, the oil and gas company. There have been tremendously ambitious plans set out for the company, breaking it up between its regulatory functions and its economic functions, breaking up different parts of the cycle of the company, so from production to distribution and retail. That's all extremely positive, but of course we're still at the beginning of this. The company has set out a plan to issue a bond next year. That will be an incredible achievement. And then, of course, privatization by 2024. I think it is achievable, but it is an extremely difficult challenge. The other area is, of course, financial markets. Now, we've heard a lot about all of the capital investment that's going into Uzbekistan at the moment. A lot of companies investing in plant, in equipment, machinery. That will be incredibly important for getting this export-orientated economy coming, and it's extremely welcome. But a lot of that financing is still coming from state-led policy lending via state-led banks or state-owned banks or partially owned banks. Once that tap is turned on, it's hard to turn off, and it's hard to bring in foreign or private capital to stimulate that growth. So I think another sign will be liberalization in the financial sector, banking sector reform, which is underway, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Ben. So we have, let's say, 5 minutes. I think there are a couple questions. Let's take them both, and then I'll have the panelists answer. So first question there, please.
Hi, my name is Joanna Leles. I'm from The Economist, and I have a question for For Mr. Muhammad Kulov. First of all, thanks everyone for the great presentations on a lot of the kind of positive economic reforms that we've seen in Uzbekistan very dynamically over the last few years. And Mr. Muhammad Kulov talked a lot about the media and opening up the space for public discussion. The Economist also accredited, thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad Kulov, to report in Uzbekistan. But my question to you, in fact, very briefly, two questions. Red lines in the media, in media reporting. I'm hearing a lot from journalists on the ground that there are still a lot of red lines in media reporting. And I'm talking instructions from the top as well as self-censorship. What about that when it comes to public dialogue and discussion? And you talked about the importance of your job in terms of citizen participation, because it's important for the government in the reforms and in also getting a broad church when it comes to dialogue and deciding what's best for Uzbekistan. My question on that is, what about the parliamentary election coming up in December? You have no opposition parties in the country, you have no opposition participation. Does that reveal limitations on the will for political reform in Uzbekistan? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Is there a second question, or are we going to take those two? Okay, let's go for that. Akram, important but difficult questions, so please.
So, thank you very much, and good to have you in Uzbekistan. In terms of red lines and self-censorship, unfortunately, we do have to admit that we still have a certain level of self-censorship existing, and we're aware of that. I think since we're going through this transformation process, right, and understanding where we're coming from, there are certain things that are lagging behind in terms of full, let's say, features of a liberal democracy that we're used to, and myself also used to where I lived. So I think we, since we're aware that we have them, we always encourage the journalists, and we encourage them, and we also support them. We always tell them that we will be there, to support you. It's so from our position and our message to our journalists is that they should be free in their reporting. So if we do face this phenomena, right, we're hoping that will fade away with time. But official position of the government is that it shouldn't be there. The journalists shouldn't feel this fear of that their reporting will be censored or they will be prosecuted for any this or that message. So that's the phenomenon that probably is still there, but it's something that we're sure will go away. On parliamentary elections, again, if you're following our political climate, you will see that the parties are taking a far more vocal stance in the political life of the country. They're making positions on certain key issues. And the parliamentary elections that we will have now, they will be fundamentally different from all parliamentary elections that we had before. So it's a certain process that we go through when the grassroots growth of democratic participation and then the government supporting this participation, it sort of has to come into one. And I think these are challenging aspects of building truly democratic society, and I think we have to abide with certain time when we will have, as you mentioned, political parties in opposition to the government or in opposition to each other, because their messages that if you really look into them, they're quite diverse already, and they are making quite a few statements, and you will see that the public is actually reacting to these statements quite loudly as well.
Thank you. So what we have heard just now is an overview of, kind of the process. And as Akram was describing, these are processes that are still underway. But what I think is encouraging is that there's a clear commitment in each of these diverse areas towards the necessary ingredients for reform.